These cases began as an investigation into family child sex abuse.
These cases began as an investigation into family child sex abuse. 9 words, read cold into a microphone by a county prosecutor. And behind them, 16 children who were living in a single room in a 100-year-old house in rural Ohio.
These cases began as an investigation into family child sex abuse. Law enforcement sought the DNA of Gary Siders, Jr. related to the child sex abuse case. Once Siders, Jr. was located, search warrants were executed to secure his DNA for genetic testing. Upon serving the search warrants for the child sex abuse case, the existence and condition of the 16 children at the Omar Street house became known. The child sex abuse cases involve intrafamily relations and do not pose a risk to the general public, and I would also add, does not involve human trafficking. This case all started with diligent Dollar General clerks calling authorities with concerns over children they observed. We asked the public to be mindful of the circumstances around them, especially involving children. We continue to ask for the public's respect for the rights and privacy of the child victims in this case. I'd like to add a thank you to the Vinton County Sheriff's Office and BCI for their investigative efforts, which have been amazing. This case is going to be prosecuted by myself, Kara Keating, Assistant Attorney General, and Annika Collins, Highland County Prosecuting Attorney. Thank you.
Here's your visual anchor. A courthouse door in one of the poorest counties in the state, opening onto a hallway lined with case files stacked 3 deep, each one a separate thread of the same family story, and every thread leading back to the same address on Omar Street.
A Vinton County grand jury today has issued indictments in 3 criminal cases involving sexual abuse and child endangerment. These charges stem from criminal investigations conducted by the Vinton County Sheriff's Office and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigations, BCI. The cases are being prosecuted by the Vinton County Prosecutor's Office with the assistance from the Highland County Prosecutor's Office and the Ohio Attorney General's Special Prosecutions Unit. In December of 2025, at the request of the Vinton County Sheriff's Office, BCI's Special Victims Unit opened an investigation into allegations of sexual abuse involving 2 children. Information obtained in this investigation prompted BCI in March of 26 to open a second investigation, this one involving allegations of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. On June 30th, authorities executed a search warrant at a residence in Hamden, Ohio, and Vinton County on Omar Street. There have been a lot of speculation and questions regarding the June 30th presence on Omar Street in Hamden. These indictments provide some insight into the ongoing investigation. However, to preserve the integrity of the ongoing investigation and to protect the victims, I conclude my statement here. I am thankful for the work of my deputies and our fellow partners at BCI. We will continue to pursue justice in these cases.
That's what this case actually looks like from the inside. Not one crime, a filing cabinet of them. And prosecutors are only now telling the public which drawers they've opened.
It happened on a Tuesday morning around 10 a.m. in a village so small most Ohioans couldn't point to it on a map. Hamden, Ohio, sits in Vinton County, roughly 60 miles southeast of Columbus and about 2 hours from Cincinnati. Fewer than 1,000 people live there. It's the kind of place with more trees than traffic lights, tucked into the hill country of Appalachian, Ohio, in a county that is, and this is not an exaggeration, it is a matter of public record, one of the poorest and least populated counties in the entire state. Deputies from the Vinton County Sheriff's Office, backed up by agents from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, pulled up to a modest home on Omar Street that morning with a search warrant in hand. On paper, this was supposed to be routine. They weren't there because of any tip about children. They weren't expecting what they were about to walk into. According to officials, this search was connected to a separate ongoing parallel investigation, one authorities have publicly tied to allegations of domestic abuse and child neglect that had been building for roughly a month. It's worth sitting with that for a second. Law enforcement had already been circling this family for weeks before June 30th, without yet knowing what was behind that door. What they found inside stopped the investigation cold and started a completely different one. 16 children, living in a single 12 by 12-foot room. The children ranged in age from about 18 months old to 18 years old. Some reports put the youngest closer to 20 months. Either way, we are talking about a baby not yet old enough to walk confidently on one end and a legal adult on the other, sharing the same room, the same conditions, the same walls. Vinton County Sheriff Ryan Kane, a man with 22 years in law enforcement, told reporters that nothing in his career had prepared him for what he saw that day.
Before we go deeper into what the records actually show, make sure you're subscribed to The Crime Infinity, because we don't just cover the story, we follow the evidence. Let's start with Exhibit 1, the indictment itself. A Vinton County grand jury has formally charged Gary Siders II, sometimes called Gary Jr., and his wife Elizabeth Siders with 4 felony counts apiece. 2 counts of sexual battery, 2 counts of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. According to the indictment, the conduct is alleged to have occurred between January and September of 2022, nearly 4 years before the world had ever heard the name Siders.
At BCI, we will continue to pursue justice in these cases.
The grand jury has indicted Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders on 4 felony charges each, 2 counts of sexual battery and 2 counts of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. I've learned law enforcement learned of Gary Jr. and Elizabeth during a separate sex abuse investigation that started back in...
Here's the irony explosion. The same press release that names those charges also states, in writing, that the alleged victim in this case was not a member of the couple's immediate family. But the Vinton County prosecutor, standing at a podium describing the broader set of cases, called this family child sex abuse and specifically used the word intrafamily. 2 official statements, 1 case, and they don't fully agree with each other.
In December of 2025. Okay, so to really dig into these breaking new details, I want to bring in Ron O'Brien. He is the former Franklin County prosecutor at Franklin County, surrounds and is part of Columbus, Ohio. So Ron, thank you so much for coming on. Just first of all, your reaction to both Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders being charged with sex crimes involving minors.
Well, that was somewhat telegraphed, as we talked about the other day, by statement of the prosecutor from Vinton County in opposing reduction of bond for Elizabeth. And so we knew something was coming. What seems surprising about this, and it is really unclear as to who the alleged victims are, it looks like the indictment or charges against the 2 Siders go back to 2022, the first quarter of 2022, against unnamed victims, but they were related to the investigation of the other 2 people indicted on sex offenses today. Curiously enough, the press release indicates that the victims were not a member of the immediate family of the Siders, but at the same time, the statement given by the county prosecutor would seem that...
Not a member of the immediate family. Intrafamily abuse. Sit with that contradiction, because it's the engine driving this entire second wave of charges. Here's how prosecutors say the pieces actually connect. This didn't start with the 16 children found in that house on June 30th. It started months earlier, in December of 2025, when Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigation opened a case involving allegations of sexual abuse against 2 children. That investigation reportedly led directly to 2 other men, separately indicted alongside the Siders, and it was during that inquiry, according to officials, that Gary Jr. and Elizabeth's names surfaced for the first time.
Another child in the family.
And at least since the 2 investigations were tied, the ones for which the indictment on the sex offenses against the Siders today arose from the investigation of the other 2 men indicted in the case. It may be that the same victims are involved, and that in the course of the first investigation, The victims relayed that the Siders also were involved either with the knowledge of the two other men also indicted today, or whether or not they was a follow-up.
And I've learned that investigation one, which involves Josh Saunders and Brandon Henderson, this is investigation one that it began in December of 2025. The information about Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders was developed from that investigation. So that is what led the law enforcement officers initially to that house on June 30th. People were saying, oh, it's because they went there for a public indecency warrant for Gary Jr. I think you and I knew the whole time, and I've been saying the whole time, no, they didn't go there with a search warrant for a public indecency case.
Investigators needed Gary Jr.'s DNA. Search warrants were issued to secure it. And it was executing those warrants tied to a completely different sex abuse case, that deputies first learned what was actually happening inside the house on Omar Street. Let that land. The 16 children weren't the reason law enforcement went to that address. They were what deputies found while looking for something else entirely. So here's your ticking clock question. If a DNA warrant in an unrelated case is what finally opened that door, how many other doors in how many other counties might still be closed? Now for the parallel narrative, because two entirely separate tracks were apparently running before the raid, and both converged on the same porch.
Where the story gets genuinely confusing, and where even months later there is still real disagreement about exactly what brought police to that door on June 30th. About a month before the raid, in May of 2026, authorities allege Gary Siders Jr. exposed himself to people outside his own household on 4 separate occasions: May 23rd, May 27th, May 29th, and May 31st. A warrant connected to those allegations, 4 counts of public indecency, a 4th-degree misdemeanor, was formally issued on June 30th. The exact same day, deputies executed the search warrant at the house and found the 16 children. Because of that timing, a lot of early reporting assumed the two things were directly connected. That police went to that house specifically because of the indecent exposure allegations. Officials have never fully confirmed that. In fact, some reporting has specifically stated the opposite, that the search stemmed from a separate parallel investigation tied to allegations of domestic abuse and child neglect, one that had reportedly already been underway for roughly a month before the raid, completely apart from the public indecency case. Defense attorneys for the family have gone on record saying they don't believe the indecent exposure case was the reason authorities showed up at all. What we're left with, months later, is this. There were 2 separate legal threads converging on the same family on the exact same day, and officials still have not fully clarified for the public which one actually opened the door. The search warrant affidavit that would answer that question has, at various points, been sealed. One detail that hasn't gotten much attention: the officer who filed the complaint in the public indecency case wasn't even a local Vinton County deputy. Court records show it was a special agent from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the same state-level unit, notably, that assisted with the search of the Siders' home. BCI agents typically handle major felonies, crimes against children and the elderly, and other cases beyond the scope of a small rural sheriff's department. Their presence on the indecent exposure complaint weeks before the raid suggests state investigators may have already been circling this family longer than the public timeline initially suggested. A forensic psychology researcher who studies offenders and predatory behavior later told reporters she wanted investigators to look closely at that indecent exposure pattern specifically, not as a side issue, but as a potential escalation in predatory behavior worth examining in the context of everything else found in that house. Whether that thread connects to the broader child endangerment case is something that, as of this video, has not.
Track 1. The sex abuse investigation reaching back to December 2025, expanding by March 2026 into a second inquiry involving allegations of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. Track 2. Growing concern from ordinary people in the community.
And, you know, we still have pieces of this puzzle that we are assembling. One thing that really piqued my interest was that William Archer, the Vinton County prosecutor, said that alert Dollar General employees contacted law enforcement about their concerns about some of the children that they saw with Gary Jr. and Elizabeth Siders. They were very concerned. And so it seems like potentially we may have had a couple of different things going on here. We have Dollar General employees, and then we also have this investigation one where information is gathered and gleaned about the couple. And all of that was enough to potentially get this search warrant for the house on June 30th.
Yes, and at least it's probably the addition of all that kind of information, potentially from co-defendants, victims on the first case, and the children may have said something at the Dollar General to an employee there that piqued their interest and passed it on to law enforcement, and then they were already looking into the matters the other two men and the Siders had been involved in going back. That's 4 years that the alleged misconduct in that case is alleged to occurred.
According to the prosecutor's own account, employees at a local Dollar General had noticed something about the children they'd seen with Gary Jr. and Elizabeth, and they called it in. Not investigators, not a mandated reporter in a school hallway. Retail clerks behind a register, doing the one thing a system that had missed this family for years apparently couldn't do on its own. That's the same phrase worth repeating here. Not a member of the immediate family. Because whoever the alleged 2022 victim actually is, the state has now said, on the record, twice, that this case runs both inside and outside the boundaries of that household, and hasn't yet reconciled the two. Now, the grandparents. Gary Siders Sr., 73, and his wife Christina, both indicted, but not for sex offenses. Their charges are entirely different in kind. 2 counts of second-degree felony child endangering, 10 third-degree felony counts, and 7 misdemeanor counts, all related to the conditions the 16 children were found living in.
Now, let's slow down, because the specifics matter, and because this is the part of the case that turned a local child endangerment arrest into national news within 24 hours. The house itself, according to public property records, was built in 1900. It's a century-old 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom home with a total living space of a little over 1,000 square feet, worth an estimated $112,000. Investigators say roughly 20 people, 16 children and the 4 adults, were living inside it. 20 people. 1 bathroom. Sheriff Kane, describing the scene to reporters, said he personally observed a high presence of bacterial matter and human feces while collecting evidence. He didn't stop there. He said the children were literally about to fall through the floor. A description of the physical structure of the room itself, not just its cleanliness. Officers reported seeing stacks of garbage throughout the property. The strongest smell of waste reportedly came from the home's basement, while the children themselves were believed to have spent most of their time confined to the room upstairs. Investigators described the children as appearing almost feral, a word Attorney General Wilson used directly, and one that Sheriff Kane and other officials echoed in different ways. Some of the children, officials said, showed limited ability to communicate. The Attorney General's office would not elaborate publicly on the children's emotional state, citing their privacy and ongoing care, but did confirm that several were in serious enough medical condition that getting them treatment was, in Wilson's words, the number one concern the moment law enforcement arrived. To the point, he said, that some of the children's lives were considered to be in danger in that moment. Not every claim about the case has held up cleanly under scrutiny, and that itself is a detail worth knowing. Dorian Baum, the attorney representing Gary Siders Sr., pushed back hard and publicly on the feral and illiterate characterizations. He pointed out that at least a few of the older children, including the two oldest, appear to have had active social media accounts, including Facebook and Snapchat pages, with posts and private messages on record. One set of messages, reportedly between one of the older girls and someone she referred to online as an internet boyfriend overseas, has circulated as evidence that at least some communication and outside contact existed, complicating the picture of total isolation. Baum's argument was blunt. If these kids were as illiterate and cut off as officials claimed, how were they posting online at all? Prosecutors and reporters covering the case have acknowledged this is a genuine open question. The children's actual literacy, verbal ability, and level of isolation appear to have varied significantly.
No allegations of sexual abuse were brought against either of them in this indictment. According to legal analysts who've reviewed the filing, that split matters. It tells you, in the state's own charging decisions, where prosecutors believe the evidence currently stops, and where, for now, it doesn't reach. For now is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Prosecutors have publicly acknowledged the investigation remains open, which under Ohio law means a superseding indictment, new charges, potentially new victims, can still be filed against any of the four defendants while this case is pending.
These allegations involving Gary Jr. and Elizabeth, as you stated, go back years. But as we know, things like this, it doesn't seem like it's usually a one and done. So the sheriff said that this investigation is ongoing. And we know from the Vinton County prosecutor telling the commissioners we're seeking permanent custody of the children, that's going to happen. And they will more than likely be successful in obtaining permanent custody of the children, especially if there's a conviction on a sex crime. So I'm thinking to myself, if this investigation is ongoing, is there going to be more there? Are we going to see potentially more indictments?
Well, at least if they thought they had enough on intrafamily sexual misconduct, I would have included it in the indictment today. And so either they don't have enough because it wasn't going on inside the family home, or the children are still in the process of being interviewed, going through social workers and psychological treatment and testing, and they may not want to proceed at this point. They can always, as you know, produce a superseding indictment with new charges, new victims, after they're arraigned on this indictment and while it's pending.
Here's the hard evidence piece that's easy to miss in the noise. The reason Gary Jr. and Elizabeth's names came up at all traces back to a separate proceeding, the case against the two other men indicted in the original abuse investigation. Legal observers following the filings believe the connection likely runs one of two ways. Either information from those two co-defendants pointed investigators toward the Siders, or the alleged victims in that original case said something that implicated the couple directly. Officials haven't said which. What they have confirmed is that whatever came out of that first thread was enough, on its own, to bring an assistant attorney general and a special prosecutions unit to a rural county for what outside observers initially assumed was a routine indecency warrant. It wasn't routine. It was never going to be.
And that brings us back to the phrase that keeps resurfacing every time officials try to describe this case in a single sentence: not a member of the immediate family. Third time. Because if that line holds, it means the same four walls investigators spent weeks documenting for child endangerment also, separately, produced a sexual abuse case involving someone entirely outside that household. A second circle of harm that has nothing to do with the 16 children found in that room and everything to do with how long this family moved through a system built to catch exactly this and still didn't. All 4 defendants remain in custody pending arraignment on these new charges.
All 4 defendants were arraigned on July 1st, the day after the raid, appearing before Vinton County Judge Lina Featherolf Rogers. Gary Sr. and Gary Jr. went first, sitting side by side, mostly silent. Bond was set at $300,000 cash or surety for each of the 4, with conditions barring any contact between the co-defendants and no contact whatsoever with the children. Then it was Christina and Elizabeth's turn. The judge read out the charges, read out the ages of the alleged victims, and asked for a plea. And in a moment that's since been clipped and replayed across social media, Elizabeth began to speak up in her own defense before the judge could finish. "Stop," the judge said, cutting her off. "First of all, I want to remind you of your right to remain silent. This is not the time for you to argue your case." The judge entered not guilty pleas on behalf of both women, pending their ability to consult an attorney. By July 7th, all 4 had formally waived their right to a preliminary hearing, sending the case directly toward a grand jury, a closed, confidential process where prosecutors present evidence and jurors decide whether there's.
Gary Jr. and Elizabeth now face the added felony counts on top of the original 16 child endangering charges tied to conditions inside the home. Gary Sr. and Christina face only the endangering counts, still contesting, through counsel, whether they're even competent to stand trial. And the question hanging over the entire file, whether Elizabeth Siders belongs in this case as a defendant, a victim, or in the state's own unresolved framing, somehow both, remains exactly that, unresolved.
Vinton County Sheriff Ryan Kane was asked directly whether investigators were looking at Elizabeth as a possible victim herself, separate from the criminal charges she's facing. His answer was careful but telling. He said it remains part of the ongoing investigation, not a denial, not a confirmation. An open question from the sheriff's own mouth, months into the case. Elizabeth's defense attorney, J. Thomas Stolley, has walked a similarly careful line. In one filing, he noted that Elizabeth has no prior criminal history and no history of failing to appear in court, factors that matter for bond decisions. He's also stated that his office doesn't yet know whether she'll ultimately be characterized as a victim within the investigation, adding that she herself doesn't necessarily describe herself that way. In a separate court motion seeking her release, Stolley wrote that Elizabeth's principal desire is to reunite with her children, and that she understands reunification is impossible if she doesn't first show the court she can comply with its conditions. On the other side of that argument, at least one expert consulted by reporters has pushed back on the idea that Elizabeth's role should be minimized. A source identified in reporting only by the surname Degonia argued that whatever happened to Elizabeth earlier in her life, she never called 911 herself and never intervened to stop what was allegedly happening to her own children over the course of nearly 2 decades. That's the tension at the center of this entire part of the case. Coercive control is a real, well-documented pattern in abusive family systems, and experts note it can absolutely explain why a person stays silent for years. But it doesn't erase the fact that, as an adult, she was also a mother to every child in that room.
If you want to look past our framing and into the primary source, start with the Vinton County Prosecutor's Office press release announcing these 3 indictments, and read it directly against the original June 30th charging documents from the child endangerment case. Line up the language yourself, intrafamily against not a member of the immediate family, and decide which one you think the evidence actually supports. Tell us your read in the comments. If you want the next update on this case broken down the same way, document first, framing second, Hit like, share this with someone following the story, subscribe to the Crime Infinity, and turn on notifications, because this file is still open, and we'll be here when the next filing drops.